A city of golden gates stood directly in the path of the fastest army in Europe. Behind ancient stone walls, German soldiers had been given a single order: hold the river at any cost. Ahead of them, General George Patton's tanks were already turning east, closing the distance, mile by mile. For 4 years, the people of Nancy had watched other cities burn. They had watched church towers fall and market squares turn to rubble. Now the war was coming to their own doorstep, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. 10 days. That is how long the battle for this one city would last. 10 days of shell fire across the Moselle River, of soldiers crawling through vineyards under machine gun fire, of a general who refused to slow down no matter the cost. And yet, when the smoke finally cleared, something impossible had happened. The 18th century gates of Place Stanislas, Gilde in Gold, stood exactly as they had before. The first shot was fired. How does a city survive 10 days of one of the bloodiest campaigns in Patton's advance through France almost untouched? And what does it cost the men who make that survival possible? This is the story of the Battle of Nancy and the army that refused to stop. By the last week of August 1944, the Third Army had run out of road faster than it had run out of gasoline. For weeks, General George Patton's tanks had been eating up the French countryside at a pace nobody in Washington had planned for. 50 miles in a single day, sometimes more, town after town, falling behind them almost before the maps could be redrawn. Then, on the last day of August, the advance simply stopped, not because the Germans had found a way to hold the line, because the trucks carrying fuel from the beaches of Normandy could not keep up with an army moving that fast. For 5 days, Patton's tanks sat still in the fields of eastern France, their engines silent, their crews stretched out in the shade of hedgerows they had fought so hard to reach. The men used the time, as soldiers always do, cleaning weapons that did not need cleaning, writing letters that said less than they meant to say, sleeping in patches of sun, because sleep was the one thing the war had never let them have enough of. Some of them walked into nearby fields and traded cigarettes and chocolate with farmers who watched them with cautious, searching eyes, unsure yet whether these were the men who would finally end the occupation or simply another army passing through on its way to somewhere else. Patton hated every hour of the delay. He had spent his entire career believing that speed was the only thing that mattered in war, that a stalled army was a dying army. And here he was, watching the greatest opportunity of his life leak away one empty fuel drum at a time. He paced the dirt floor of his command post, staring at maps that had not changed since the day before, demanding hourly updates on convoys that could not move any faster, no matter how much. To the officers around him, it was the most dangerous version of Patton, not the one who took risks in battle, but the one forced to sit still while the enemy used every stolen hour to dig deeper into the ground ahead of him. When the tankers finally arrived in the first days of September, Patton did not waste a single hour. His orders were simple: move east, cross the Moselle River, take the city of Nancy. Nancy was not just another town on the map. For nearly 200 years, it had been considered one of the most beautiful cities in France, built around a public square, so elegant that visitors came from across Europe just to stand inside it. At its four corners stood gates of wrought iron, Gilde and Gold leaf, crafted by a master ironworker in the 1750s for a duke who wanted his capital to shine. The people of the region called it the City of Golden Gates for 4 years. That gold had sat dulled under German occupation, and the people who lived beneath it had learned to keep their heads down and wait. They had also learned, by watching the news trickle in from other towns across Normandy and Brittany, exactly what liberation could cost. Cities they knew by name had been reduced to broken teeth of stone. Churches that had stood since the days of the Crusades had been turned to rubble in an afternoon. Bridges older than the nation itself had been blown apart by retreating Germans or shattered by advancing Americans. And nobody on either side seemed able to stop it. Once the shooting started, so when word reached Nancy that the American Third Army was moving east, first, the relief that people felt was mixed with something closer to dread. Liberation was coming. So, perhaps, was destruction in the square itself. Life had not entirely stopped, even under occupation. Old men still gathered near the fountains in the early morning to talk in low voices about news they were not supposed to have heard. Children still chased pigeons across the cobblestones, too young to fully understand why their parents flinched at the sound of engines. Shopkeepers still opened their doors each day, even with half-empty shelves, because keeping the rhythm of ordinary life alive felt like its own small act of defiance. The golden gates at the corners of the square had long since stopped gleaming the way they once had, dulled by 4 years without polish, without celebration, without the kind of civic pride that occupation makes impossible. But they were still there, still standing exactly where the Duke's ironworker had placed them nearly 2 centuries earlier. And to the people of Nancy, that alone had come to mean something. On the German side of the river, the orders were just as clear and just as unforgiving. The 553rd Volksgrenadier Regiment, dug into positions in and around the city, had been told by their commanders to hold the crossings over the Moselle at any cost. Behind them stood the larger structure of the 47th Panzer Corps, tasked with slowing Patton's advance long enough for German forces further east to prepare a stronger defensive line. These were not the seasoned veterans who had swept through France 4 years earlier. Many of the men in the trenches around Nancy were recent conscripts, teenagers and older reservists thrown together into hastily formed units, armed with whatever weapons remained after years of losses on the Eastern Front. But desperation has its own kind of discipline, and these soldiers understood exactly what would happen to them and to the towns behind them. If the line broke at night in the trenches along the riverbank, those young conscripts listened to the same silence the Americans listened to from the other side. Broken only by the wind, moving through vineyard rows heavy with late summer grapes, nobody would have time to harvest. Some of them were barely out of school. Others were older men pulled from factory jobs and farms, handed a rifle and a uniform 2 sizes too large, and told that the fate of the German homeland now rested on how long on the end. Whatever they believed about the war, by that point, fear was no longer an abstract thing. It sat beside them in the dark, as real and as close as the man dug in next to them. The Moselle itself was not a wide river, but it did not need to be. It ran through low ground thick with vineyards, the kind of terrain where a man could crawl on his stomach for an hour and cover barely 100 yards. On both banks, German engineers had spent weeks digging in machine gun nests, positioning artillery on the high ground overlooking the crossings and mining every stretch of open field that offered an American tank. A clear approach. Anyone trying to cross would be doing so in full view of gunners who had been waiting and preparing for exactly this moment. Patton knew all of this. He had studied the terrain reports, listened to his intelligence officers, described the German positions in detail, and he had made his decision anyway. 2 divisions would force the crossing, one to the north of the city, one to the south, squeezing Nancy between them, like a pair of hands closing around a fist. To exploit whatever gap opened, an armored division would be held in reserve, ready to pour through the moment. Infantry cleared a path wide enough for tanks. It was, on paper, a straightforward plan. In practice, it meant sending young men across open water directly into the guns of soldiers who had nowhere left to retreat. Behind the front lines, The war moved differently, but no less painfully. The supply convoys that fed Patton's advance rolled through village after village, along narrow country roads never built for trucks of that size, and every mile brought its own small collisions between the machinery of a modern army and the fragile, centuries-old world it was passing through. Stone walls that had stood since before the French Revolution sometimes caught the edge of a wide turn and crumbled into the road. Church courtyards built for ox carts creaked under the weight of vehicles never meant to travel through them. None of it was intentional. The soldiers driving those trucks were focused on the war ahead of them, not the walls behind them, and most never even knew what they had brushed against as they passed. But the people watching from doorways and windows knew they had spent 4 years protecting what little the occupation had left them, and now they watched it tremble every time a convoy rolled through, unsure whether the army bringing their freedom would also, without meaning to, take away everything that had made their home worth freeing. It was a quiet, almost invisible cost of the campaign, rarely written into after-action reports, rarely remembered alongside the battles that made the headline, but it followed the Third Army east, all the way to the gates of Nancy, a low current of worry running underneath the roar of engines and the crack of distant artillery. Somewhere in every village along that route, someone stood watching the trucks pass, hoping their church, their wall would still be standing when the war finally moved on. By the 4th of September, the last of the fuel convoys had caught up with the frontline units, and Patton's headquarters issued the final orders. The attack on the Moselle crossings would begin the next morning. Reconnaissance patrols had already probed the riverbanks under cover of darkness, drawing fire that confirmed what the maps had suggested. The Germans were there, dug in, and they were not planning to leave. That night, in farmhouses and barns, commandeered as forward command posts, young officers pored over maps by lantern light, marking crossing points, calculating how long it would take engineers to throw pontoon bridges across the water once the far bank was clear. Soldiers wrote letters home that some of them would never send, somewhere behind the German lines. Teenage conscripts checked their weapons one more time and waited for the sound that would tell them the Americans were coming. Above it all, unseen in the darkness, the golden gates of Nancy stood locked and silent, caught between two armies that neither one of them had asked to fight over. Nobody on either side of the river that night could have said with any certainty whether those gates would still be standing when the sun came up over the Moselle. The attack began before dawn on the 5th of September, in a gray half-light that turned the Moselle into a ribbon of dull pewter winding through the valley. To the north of Nancy, engineers of the 80th Infantry Division moved down to the water's edge carrying rubber assault boats on their shoulders, their boots sinking into mud, churned soft by weeks of late summer rain. To the south, the 35th Infantry Division prepared its own crossing, spread along a stretch of riverbank, lined with vineyard terraces that offered cover for perhaps 20 yards before opening into flat, exposed ground. The plan looked clean on paper. 2 divisions would force their way across the river on opposite ends of the city, squeezing the German defenders from both directions while denying them the chance to concentrate their strength in any single place. An armored division, held back in reserve, would pour through the moment infantry secured a foothold wide enough for tanks to follow. Patton had approved it without hesitation. He had little patience for plans that tried to be clever. He wanted pressure applied everywhere, all at once, until something gave way. What the plan could not account for was what waited on the far bank. The German defenders dug into positions that had been prepared for weeks, let the first boats reach open water before opening fire. Machine guns positioned on high ground raked the surface of the river in long, sweeping arcs. Mortar rounds walked across the crossing points in careful, practiced patterns, the kind that come from gunners who have spent days ranging their weapons against a stretch of water. They know their enemy has no choice but to cross. Men who had trained for months learned in the space of a few seconds what it felt like to be truly exposed. Sitting in a rubber boat with nothing between them and the enemy but a few feet of moving water and the thin hope that the next round would land somewhere else, the first attempt north of the city stalled within minutes. Boats capsized under near misses, spilling men and equipment into water that ran cold even in early September. Soldiers who made it to the far bank found themselves pinned against the shoreline, unable to advance, unable to retreat, calling for artillery support that took precious minutes to arrive. By the time the guns behind them finally answered, several boats had already been lost, along with the men who had been in them. It took most of the morning and a second, third, and fourth wave of crossings before American troops finally secured a foothold on the eastern bank north of Nancy. Engineers worked through the chaos to begin construction of a pontoon bridge, hammering pilings into the riverbed while German artillery continued to search for the range, throwing up columns of muddy water that soaked the men working just feet away. Every hour the bridge remained unfinished was an hour the infantry on the far side had to hold their position with nothing but rifles, grenades, and whatever ammunition they had managed to carry across in their pockets. The men who reached the far bank in those first hours found themselves in a strange, narrow world bounded by water on one side and enemy fire on the other. There was no cover to speak of beyond a shallow rise in the ground and a few scattered clumps of brush, and every soldier who crossed learned quickly to move in short bursts, a few feet at a time, dropping flat the moment a machine gun somewhere ahead began to traverse in their direction. Radio operators crouched low, shouting coordinates back across the river for artillery support, their voices barely audible over the noise of incoming rounds. Officers who had trained for years to lead men in exactly this kind of fight found themselves reduced to the same basic calculations as every private beside them. How far to the next scrap of cover? How many rounds left? How long until the bridge behind them could bear the weight of a tank? What kept that first foothold from collapsing was not any single decision or any single act of heroism, but the accumulation of hundreds of small ones, a machine gun team that held its position an extra 20 minutes under fire, a runner who crawled 100 yards through open ground to deliver a message when the radio failed, a sergeant who refused to let his squad fall back even after half of them had been hit. None of it looked like the kind of moment that gets written into history books. All of it was the reason the crossing held. To the south, the 35th Infantry Division found their own crossing no easier. German positions along this stretch of the Moselle had been reinforced with anti-tank guns capable of destroying anything short of the heaviest American armor. And for the first 2 days of the assault, progress could be measured not in miles but in individual fields. Hedgerows and stone farmhouses fought over, one at a time, a single German machine gun position, well concealed in the ruins of a barn, could hold up an entire company for hours. Taking it usually meant a flanking maneuver through open ground under fire. Or, when time ran short, a direct assault that traded lives for yards of muddy French farmland. The vineyard terraces that lined this stretch of the river, planted generations earlier by families whose names were carved into the stone gateposts of nearby farmhouses, became a landscape almost unrecognizable from what they had been only weeks before. Rows of vines that should have been heavy with fruit ready for the autumn harvest were instead cut down by shrapnel, trampled by boots, churned into the earth by tank treads searching for solid ground. Soldiers on both sides found themselves fighting through terrain that offered just enough concealment to make every advance a gamble. A low stone wall that might hide a rifleman, a drainage ditch that might hide an entire squad, a farmhouse that looked abandoned right up until the moment a shot rang out from an upstairs window. Weather added its own cruelty to the fighting. Early September rain turned the low ground along the river into thick, clinging mud that swallowed boots and slowed every movement, making the simple act of advancing 50 yards under fire into an exhausting physical ordeal, even before accounting for the enemy trying to stop it. Tanks that might otherwise have provided quick support to infantry pinned down in the open sometimes could not reach them at all. Bogged down on tracks, better suited to firm summer ground than the softened fields of early autumn. By the second day of the battle, word reached Patton's headquarters that both crossings were bogged down, taking casualties faster than replacements could be brought forward. In another commander, this news might have prompted a pause, a reconsideration of the plan, perhaps even a request for reinforcements before pressing further. Patton's response was to demand more pressure, not less. He believed, with the kind of certainty that had defined his entire career, that the greatest danger in this moment was not losing men in the crossing, but losing momentum on the far side of it. A slow, cautious advance would give the Germans time to reposition their reserves and turn a difficult crossing into an impossible one. Speed, even costly speed, was the only path that made the casualties already suffered mean something. It was a philosophy that worked, and a philosophy that cost lives in equal measure. Medics working just behind the front line during those first days later described conditions that pushed the limits of what field hospitals so close to the fighting could handle. Wounded men arrived faster than they could be triaged, carried on stretchers by soldiers who then turned around and went straight back to the fighting themselves. The vineyards that had, weeks earlier, looked almost peaceful in the late summer sun now held craters where artillery had torn through neat rows of vines, the grapes that would never be harvested crushed into the mud alongside spent shell casings and torn equipment. At the aid stations set up just far enough behind the crossings to be out of direct rifle range, though rarely far enough to escape artillery entirely, surgeons and medics worked in makeshift tents lit by lanterns and whatever daylight filtered through canvas walls. The wounded arrived in a steady, exhausting rhythm, some able to walk in on their own, supported by a friend, others carried on stretchers by men who had themselves been fighting only minutes earlier. There was rarely time for more than the most urgent care before the next casualty arrived, and the medics learned to make decisions in seconds that, in any other setting, might have taken a doctor hours to consider. The sound of the fighting up ahead never fully faded from these tents, a constant reminder that every hour of surgery performed here was matched by more young men falling on the riverbank a short distance away. Chaplains moved between the wounded and the dying, offering what comfort they could to men far from home, some of them barely out of their teenage years, most of them more frightened than they would ever admit aloud. For every soldier whose name would later appear in a division history or an after-action report, there were dozens more whose entire contribution to the battle was measured only in the fact that they had held a position, carried a wounded friend, or kept firing long enough for the man beside them to reload. Patton's reputation across the Third Army had long been built on a habit his soldiers recognized instantly. A general who rarely commanded from a safe distance, officers who served under him throughout the Lorraine campaign described someone who moved forward often, close enough to the fighting to ask his questions in person rather than by radio, about ammunition, about German strength, about how much further a line needed to push before a crossing could be considered secure. It was a reputation earned over years, not invented for this single battle, and it shaped how his soldiers understood the orders he gave them. Whatever else could be said about Patton's demand for speed, regardless of cost, the men fighting under him did not see it as coming from someone unwilling to face the same danger himself, by the fourth day, the situation on the northern crossing began, slowly, to turn. Engineers finally completed a bridge capable of supporting armor, and the first tanks of the 4th Armored Division began rolling across the Moselle to reinforce the infantry who had spent 3 days holding a narrow strip of riverbank against everything the Germans could throw at them. The arrival of American armor changed the character of the fighting almost immediately. German positions that had held against infantry alone found themselves outmatched against tanks capable of destroying a machine gun nest with a single round, and the German line north of Nancy, though it did not break, began to bend. Tank crews who crossed the new bridge in those early hours described the strange, disorienting shift from the open, exposed fighting of the riverbank to the tighter, more claustrophobic combat of the villages beyond it. Narrow lanes barely wide enough for a single tank, stone buildings on either side that could hide an anti-tank gun behind any window or doorway. Church steeples that offered German observers a clear view of American movement for miles in every direction. Every intersection had to be approached as though it might be the one place the enemy had chosen to make a stand. And more than once, it was. Tank commanders learned quickly to lead with infantry scouting ahead on foot rather than pushing armor forward blind. A slower, more cautious rhythm than Patton's headquarters would have preferred, but one that saved tanks and the men inside them from ambushes that could otherwise have ended the advance in a single afternoon south of the city. Progress remained grinding and slow. The terrain favored the defenders, and every field gained came at a cost that seemed, from a distance, disproportionate to the ground itself. Officers on the ground began to describe the fighting less as a battle with a clear front line and more as a series of small, brutal engagements, each one fought by a platoon or a company against an enemy position that had to be found, fixed, and destroyed before the advance could continue even a few hundred yards. Behind the fighting, the war's quieter, less visible cost continued to accumulate. Supply columns still needed to move forward to keep both crossings fed with ammunition, fuel, and food, and those columns still passed through the same string of villages that had watched the Third Army's advance with a mixture of hope and dread since the very first days of September. In more than one town along that route, residents emerged from their houses each morning to inspect what the previous day's traffic had left behind. A cracked well cover here, a chipped corner of a churchyard wall there. Small wounds compared to what was happening along the riverbank, but wounds that mattered enormously to people who had almost nothing else left that was entirely their own. Soldiers moving through those villages rarely had time to notice. Their orders were to keep the supply lines open, to keep the ammunition flowing forward to men who could not fight without it. And the war did not pause to let anyone consider what was being worn away in the process. By the 6th day of the battle, the German command overseeing the defense of Nancy faced a decision that was rapidly becoming unavoidable. The northern crossing had been secured and reinforced with armor. The southern crossing, though slower, continued to grind forward, absorbing losses that the depleted German units, many of them the same hastily assembled formations of conscripts and reservists who had dug in along the river a week earlier, could not sustain indefinitely. Reserves that might once have been rushed forward to seal the gap simply did not exist in the numbers required. Every unit the German commanders might have used to reinforce the line around Nancy was needed somewhere else along a front that stretched for hundreds of miles. All of it under pressure from an Allied advance that showed no sign of slowing. On the 8th day, the 4th Armored Division, now fully across the Moselle and reinforced by additional infantry, began to swing south and east in a wide arc threatening to cut behind the German positions, still defending the approaches to Nancy from the south. It was exactly the kind of maneuver Patton had built his reputation on, using armor not simply to punch through a defensive line, but to get behind it entirely, forcing an enemy to choose between retreating and being surrounded. For the German soldiers, still holding positions south of the city, many of them the same young conscripts who had spent their first days in the trenches listening to the war approach across the vineyards, the news that American tanks were now somewhere behind them carried a particular kind of dread, a fight they could understand, however terrifying. Encirclement was something else entirely. Word passed down the line in whispers and half-rumor, carried by runners and by the simple, unmistakable sound of American vehicles moving on roads that had, until recently, belonged entirely to the German rear. Some units held their positions anyway, following orders that made less and less sense with each passing hour. Others began, quietly and without official sanction, to look for ways east that had not yet been cut off. For the officers commanding the German defense, the choice facing them was no longer a question of whether the position around Nancy could be held, but how much of their remaining strength could be saved before the encirclement closed completely. Every hour spent holding the line now was an hour that risked trapping entire units inside a pocket with no way out. And the memory of what had happened to German forces caught in similar encirclements earlier that summer, entire divisions lost in a matter of days, weighed heavily on decisions being made in command posts that grew more isolated from each other as American forces cut the roads between them. Within the city of Nancy itself, the final days before liberation passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Artillery fire could be heard rolling in from the crossings to the north and south, sometimes close enough to rattle windows, sometimes distant enough to sound almost like thunder on a summer evening. Residents who had spent 4 years learning to read the sound of war from a careful distance now found themselves unable to tell from 1 hour to the next whether the fighting was moving closer or further away. Some families gathered what belongings they could carry and moved to cellars they had prepared months earlier, uncertain whether the coming battle would pass through their streets or simply around them. Others chose to stay above ground, unwilling to abandon homes that had already survived 4 years of occupation, hoping that whatever came next would spare the narrow streets and old stone buildings that had stood largely undisturbed since long before either army had been born. In the cellars beneath the city, families sat together in the dark, listening to sounds they could not identify and distances they could not judge, passing the hours the way people in every besieged city eventually learned, in quiet conversation, in prayer, in the simple, exhausting effort of trying to keep children calm when the adults around them were frightened too. Word of the fighting at the river crossings reached the city in fragments, carried by whoever had managed to move between the outskirts and the center before the roads became too dangerous to travel. Nobody in Nancy knew with any certainty how the battle outside their walls was actually going. They knew only that it had not stopped, and that every day it continued was another day their city remained caught between two armies. Neither of them had chosen to fight over. At the heart of the city, the golden gates of the great square remained closed, as they had been for most of the occupation, their gilded ironwork catching whatever light managed to filter through the smoke drifting in from the fighting outside the city limits. Nobody could say, in those final days, whether the battle would reach the square itself. The German command structure defending Nancy had given no clear indication of whether they intended to fight for the city center or fall back once the outer defenses collapsed. And that uncertainty hung over the population as heavily as the distant sound of artillery. By the 10th day, with American armor now positioned behind their remaining defensive lines and infantry pressing from both the north and south, the German units still holding ground around Nancy began a general withdrawal. It was not a rout, not in the chaotic sense, that had characterized parts of the German retreat across France earlier that summer, but it was unmistakably an acknowledgement that the position could no longer be held. Units pulled back in stages, attempting to preserve some order, even as American pressure mounted on every side, abandoning positions that had cost so much on both sides to contest over the preceding days. For the soldiers of the Third Army who had fought their way across the Moselle and around the flanks of the German defense, the news that the enemy was withdrawing brought a mixture of relief and a hard, weary kind of vindication. They had spent 10 days fighting for a river crossing and a stretch of French countryside that most of them, before the battle began, could not have found on a map. Now, with the German line finally breaking, the road into Nancy itself lay open in front of them. And somewhere beyond the outskirts of the city, though few of them yet knew it, a public square with 4 golden gates was waiting to find out whether it would survive what was coming next. On the morning of the 15th of September, American infantry moved into the outskirts of Nancy and found something none of them had quite expected after 10 days of grinding combat along the river. Silence. The streets that had been braced for a final, desperate defense stood empty of German soldiers. The units that had spent a week and a half fighting for every crossing point and every hedgerow along the Moselle now walked into the heart of the city they had bled to reach, and no one fired a shot. The withdrawal that had begun days earlier, as American armor swung behind their positions and threatened to cut off any hope of retreat, had emptied the city of its defenders before the final assault ever needed to happen. The young conscripts who had spent their first days of the battle listening to the war approach across the vineyards were, by then, either falling back toward German lines further east, already captured, or among the dead left behind at the river crossings that had cost both sides so dearly. Whatever fight had been left in the defense of Nancy had been spent along the Moselle. The city itself, in the end, did not have to be taken street by street. For the soldiers who walked into the city that morning, the transition was almost disorienting. Men who had spent 10 days flattening themselves against riverbanks and vineyard walls under artillery fire now found themselves walking down quiet streets lined with stone buildings that had stood untouched through it all. Word spread quickly from house to house that the Americans had arrived, and the reaction that followed was one that few of the exhausted, mud-covered soldiers were prepared for. Doors opened, windows filled with faces. People who had spent 4 years learning to stay silent and invisible under occupation poured into the streets, some weeping, some laughing, many simply standing and staring as though they could not quite believe what they were seeing. Flowers appeared from somewhere, pressed into the hands of soldiers who, an hour earlier, had been more concerned with staying alive than with what kind of welcome might wait for them at the end of the fighting. Bottles of wine, hidden away for years to keep them out of German hands, were pulled from cellars and offered freely to men who had not slept properly in over a week. Old men who remembered the last war embraced soldiers young enough to be their grandson. Children who had grown up knowing nothing but occupation ran alongside the columns of tired, dust-covered troops, some of them reaching out simply to touch a sleeve or a rifle strap, as though needing physical proof that the army they had heard approaching for days was finally, truly there. For soldiers who had spent the better part of 2 weeks fighting through mud and artillery fire without a single moment to consider what any of it meant beyond survival, the sudden flood of gratitude was almost overwhelming. Some of them, hardened by 10 days of combat along the river, found themselves unable to speak, accepting flowers and embraces from strangers with nothing more than a tired nod, unsure how to hold both the memory of what they had just survived and the joy of the people now surrounding them. At the center of it all stood the great square, its 4 gilded gates catching the September light exactly as they had for nearly 2 centuries. The battle that had torn through vineyards and riverbanks just a few miles away had never reached this far into the city's heart. The gates had not been touched. The elegant stone buildings surrounding the square, raised nearly 2 centuries earlier to give the city a public heart worthy of a royal capital, stood exactly as they had before. The first shot of the battle had been fired. For the people of Nancy, who had spent 10 days uncertain whether their city would survive the liberation meant to free it, the sight of those golden gates standing untouched carried a weight that went far beyond architecture. It meant that something of who they were, something older than the occupation and older than the war itself, had made it through intact. The cost of reaching that morning had been steep, and it did not disappear simply because the city center had been spared. Along the Moselle, in the vineyards and the low ground where the crossings had been fought, nearly 3,000 American soldiers had been killed or wounded over the course of 10 days, a toll that fell most heavily on the infantry divisions that had forced the river in the first place. German losses, though harder to calculate precisely given the confusion of the final withdrawal, had been severe as well, particularly among the units that had held the crossing points against the first waves of the attack, many of whose soldiers never had the chance to retreat at all. Throughout the wider campaign, Patton's own writings tended to measure battles less by their human cost than by their strategic result. And Nancy fit that same pattern. The city had fallen roughly on the timeline his headquarters had projected, despite the delay caused by the fuel shortage at the end of August. And its capture opened a vital crossing point for further advances toward the German border. In the calculus of a general fighting a continental war, 10 days and several thousand casualties to secure a major river crossing and eliminate a threat to his flank was, by the standards of the campaign, an acceptable exchange. It was the kind of judgment that had defined his entire career, and the kind that history would continue to argue over long after the guns around Nancy fell silent. For the people who actually lived in the city, the calculus looked entirely different. They had not measured the battle in strategic terms, in crossing points secured or flanks protected. They had measured it in nights spent in cellars, in the sound of artillery they could not identify, in the uncertainty of not knowing from 1 hour to the next whether the war would spare the streets they had called home for generations. When American soldiers finally walked into the square on the morning of the 15th, what they found waiting for them was not simply a liberated city, but a community that had survived something it had genuinely feared it might not. In the days immediately after liberation, the city began the slow, uneven work of returning to something resembling normal life. Even as the sound of the wider war remained close enough to hear, shops that had operated with half-empty shelves under occupation began gradually to see supplies arrive again. Families who had spent the final days of the battle in cellars emerged to find their homes standing, and in many cases spent the following weeks helping neighbors whose houses had not been so fortunate, patching roofs and clearing debris from the streets on the outskirts where the fighting had actually reached. Local officials who had operated for years under German oversight now found themselves navigating an entirely different set of challenges, coordinating with American military authorities to restore basic services, distribute food, and account for those who had not survived the occupation or the battle that ended it. In the days that followed, Nancy became something it had not been in 4 years. A place where ordinary life could begin. Cautiously, to resume, the city was quickly transformed into a vital hub for the Allied advance, a railhead and logistics center that would support Patton's continued push toward the German border in the weeks ahead. Trucks that had once carried ammunition and fuel toward the fighting now carried supplies through streets that only days earlier had echoed with distant artillery. The war had not ended for the soldiers of the Third Army. Ahead of them still lay months of harder fighting through terrain, and against defenses that would prove, in some cases, even more costly than the crossing of the Moselle. But for Nancy itself, the worst had passed. What lingered longest in the memory of those who lived through it was not the fighting along the river, terrible as it had been, but the strange, fragile fact of what had been spared. A city that had braced for destruction had instead watched its oldest, most treasured symbols survive completely untouched. A set of golden gates that had stood through a revolution, through an empire, through 4 years of occupation, and now through 10 days of one of the bloodiest river crossings of the entire campaign in France. Nobody who lived through that September could say with certainty why the fighting had spared the heart of their city while consuming so much around its edges. Look, timing, the speed of the German withdrawal, the direction American units chose to advance, all of it played some part. What mattered in the end was that when the smoke cleared and the soldiers walked into the square, the gates were still there, gleaming exactly as they always had. The Battle of Nancy rarely appears at the center of the larger story told about Patton's advance across France. It is often remembered, if at all, as one crossing among many, one city among the dozens liberated during that extraordinary summer and autumn. But for the men who fought along the Moselle, and for the people who waited out 10 days of uncertainty beneath a city they refused to abandon. It was never a footnote. It was the entire war, compressed into 10 days, fought over a river, a handful of villages, and a public square whose survival came to mean more than anyone fighting for it could have fully understood at the time. Patton would go on to push his Third Army further east in the weeks that followed, toward battles that would prove longer and, in some cases, even costlier than the fight for Nancy. But somewhere behind him, in a city he had helped liberate at a heavy price, 4 gates of gold continued to stand, watch over a square that war had come dangerously close to destroying, and did not. Whether that survival was owed to strategy, to circumstance, or simply to the particular direction the fighting happened to take that September, it remains, to this day, one of the quieter, more remarkable footnotes of the entire campaign to free France. A reminder that even in the middle of the most brutal fighting, something occasionally does make it through whole,